Is the Duke of York the unluckiest title in the British monarchy? It's been held by 14 boys and men, not including 2 pretenders, and a surprising number have come to very sticky ends. In this royal history documentary from History Calling, I take you through all the Dukes of York, including the fake ones, and explain what happened to them and why future royals might want to steer clear of what is arguably an increasingly tainted, if not seemingly cursed, title. We begin with Edmund of Langley, born in 1341 as the 4th surviving son of Edward III and Philippa of Hainaut. Originally made the Earl of Cambridge in 1361, even though his older brothers were dukes, he was eventually made the 1st Duke of York in 1385. He was married to Isabella of Castile in 1372, whose sister was the 2nd wife of his elder brother, John of Gaunt, and together they had 3 surviving children: Edward, Earl of Rutland, who we'll hear more about in a couple of minutes, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and Constance, Lady Despencer. Isabella died in 1392, aged only 37. He remarried to Joan of Kent, not to be confused with the woman of the same name who had been the wife of Edmund's brother, the Black Prince, in around 1393. They had no children, and Joan lived until 1434. Though he took part in several military campaigns, Edmund has not acquired the reputation of a great soldier, nor has he made a favourable impression on historians in other ways, in part thanks to descriptions of him by the chronicler Jean Froissart as indolent, simple, and peaceable, and by John Harding as someone who, when all the lords to council and parliament went, he would to hunt and also to hawking. Appointed as Keeper of the Realm 3 times by his nephew Richard II, and long thought loyal to the crown, he nevertheless defected to his other nephew, Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, when the exiled Bolingbroke invaded England in 1399 and deposed Richard, who was then in Ireland, having left York behind as keeper, and he became Henry IV. York was rewarded for his efforts with lands, money and titles, but had little time to enjoy them, dying in August 1402 in King's Langley. He was buried with Isabella in the church of the Friars Preacher. Next we have Edmund and Isabella's son, Edward, born in circa 1473. Known as either Edward of Langley or Edward of York, you will sometimes see him called Edward of Norwich, but Rosemary Horrocks, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, my main secondary source for a lot of the information in this video by the way, says that this is probably a misreading of Deverick of York, the appellation regularly used during his father's lifetime. Knighted at the coronation of his cousin Richard II in 1377, he was made the Earl of Rutland in 1390 and remained close to Richard for many years as one of his favourites, travelling with him on campaign and also being granted an Irish title, the Earl of Cork. He was made Duke of Aumale in 1397 and Constable of England. By 1398, he was married to Philippa Mohun, who seems to have been at least 20 years older than him and had no children by him, meaning that his heir was his nephew, another Richard. Just exactly what happened between Henry Bolingbroke and his cousin Aumale in 1399, when Bolingbroke became Henry IV, is not clear. Initially, Edward seems to have remained loyal to Richard II, but at some point things evidently changed and he ended up on Henry IV's side, just like his father. Still, it was a difficult time for him. Though he wasn't executed as a Ricardian, he did lose many lands and titles, including his dukedom, and became once again the Earl of Rutland. He was involved in a plot to kill Henry and his sons early in the new reign, yet apparently betrayed the details to the new king, thus potentially saving Henry IV's life. Certainly the monarch seems to have been sure of his cousin's loyalty, for Edward was rewarded with fresh lands and continuing signs of favour over the next few years, such as important governmental positions. When Edward's father Edmund died in 1402, he inherited the Dukedom of York, making this one of only 2 times in our story that the title has passed from father to son at the father's death. In February 1405, whilst dealing with serious financial troubles, he was accused by his sister, Constance, Lady Despencer, of conspiring against the crown and locked up at Pevensey until October. He was back in favour a year later, though, when he was made Constable of the Tower of London. In his later years, he spent much time campaigning in France, and it was at the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415, where he fought for King Henry V, who had inherited the throne from his father in 1413, that York died. His remains were returned to England and buried in the church of Fotheringhay, Northamptonshire. His wife survived him until 1431. The third Duke of York was Richard Plantagenet, grandson of Edmund of Langley, nephew of Edward of Langley, and son of Richard of Conisborough, Earl of Cambridge. His mother was Anne Mortimer, a descendant of Edward III's through that king's second son, and so young Richard, born in 1411, was descended from that king twice over. His maternal descent also gave him a better blood claim on the throne than that of Henry IV, his son Henry V, who died in 1422, and then his son Henry VI, because they were descended from Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. Richard's claim on the crown would shape his whole life and make him one of the major players in the early part of the conflict which became known as the Wars of the Roses. Orphaned in childhood, his mother died of natural causes and his father was executed in 1415 for trying to depose Henry V, he became Duke of York upon his uncle Edward's death and married his cousin Cecily Neville in the 1420s. If you see my videos on her life, you will, by default, get a much better biography of Richard than I have time to give you here. But in short, they had 7 surviving children, including the future Edward IV and Richard III, and Duke Richard played a huge role in the reign of his cousin Henry VI, to whom he was the presumptive heir until 1453, when that king and his wife Margaret of Anjou finally had a son. Richard of York spent much of his time in France, where he was the king's lieutenant twice in the 1430s and 1440s. Back in England in the 1450s, though, he was made protector of the realm twice. The first time because of Henry VI's mental breakdown, which began in 1453. To be specific, though, the protectorate dated from March 1454 to February 1455, and again for 3 months starting in November 1455 for slightly murky reasons. King Henry's branch of the family was known as the Lancastrians due to their descent from John of Gaunt, who was the Duke of Lancaster, while York's was known as the Yorks for reasons which I hope are obvious. By the mid-1450s, they were engaged in battle after battle for the throne, sometimes with one side faring better, sometimes the other. This was the conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, and so named because the Lancastrians sometimes used a red rose as one of their emblems, and the Yorks sometimes used a white. At one stage, York ended up in exile in Ireland with his second son, another Earl of Rutland, after losing the Battle of Ludford Bridge in October 1459, and he was attainted by the English Parliament. But with the help of his eldest boy, Edward Earl of March, he managed to regain the upper hand in 1460, and that October an Act of Accord was passed in Parliament which named him the heir after Henry VI's death, completely bypassing the king's young son, who was then on the run with his mother Margaret, with whom Richard had had a pretty terrible relationship for years. It was all looking very good for the Duke of York, who could expect to become Richard III in due course. But then disaster struck. Whilst at Sandal Castle in the north of England, he and his second son, Lord Rutland, left the safety of its walls to engage a Lancastrian army, and both were killed at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December. York's head was spiked and a paper crown placed on it to mock his pretensions to the throne. After an initial burial at Pontefract, he was moved many years later by his son Edward to the Church of St Mary and All Saints, Fotheringhay. Before we move on to the next Duke of York, and the one who held the title for the shortest amount of time, please remember to give the video a like, a hype, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you activate the notification bell, YouTube will also keep you up to date with all my uploads, and you can get bonus material from me, like badges next to your name and extra posts, by joining as a channel member. There are even more bonuses to be had by becoming a patron over on patreon.com/historycalling, including extra podcasts, early access to ad-free videos, plus membership of the really nice little community that we have over there. This week, for instance, I'll be providing a bonus podcast on the nursery rhyme, The Grand Old Duke of York. For free bonuses, you can join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get 2 complimentary downloads all about spotting bad history books and interviewing family members about your genealogy, plus my newsletter. Finally, if you have Irish ancestry, why not check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook and paperback, and linked below for you. That brings us to the next holder of the title Duke of York, Richard's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Born in France in 1442, this 18-year-old, good-looking, exceptionally tall youth had already proven himself a formidable military commander by the time of his father and brother Rutland's deaths, and he technically held the title Duke of York for the next 2 and a bit months, until his stunning victory over the forces of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou enabled him to take the throne as Edward IV in March 1461. Now, a discussion of the rest of Edward's life could fill a whole video, so allow me to just give you the highlights here. He secretly married the beautiful but older English Lancastrian widow Elizabeth Grey née Woodville in 1464, with whom he ultimately had 10 children, including Princess Elizabeth of York and 2 boys who would become known as the Princes in the Tower. There were also at least 2 illegitimate children, a son called Arthur Plantagenet Viscount Lisle, I'll leave my video about him linked for you, and a daughter called Grace, about whom practically nothing is known. There also seems to have been another daughter called Elizabeth, and rumours of several others, because Edward got around. During his lifetime, he had the seemingly unwavering loyalty of his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, while his middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was a constant thorn in the king's side, along with their cousin, Richard, Earl of Warwick. For the first decade of his reign, Edward IV was plagued by attempts to take the throne off him. At one point, he was captured and imprisoned in Warwick Castle by Clarence and Warwick, who then had to release him when they realised they couldn't govern England with him as a puppet king. There was a much more successful deposition in 1470 after they defected to Margaret of Anjou and her son, then living in France. Edward and Gloucester were forced into exile, Queen Elizabeth had to go into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her children, and Henry VI was released from his prison in the Tower of London, where Edward had been holding him since 1465, and put back on the throne. It lasted 6 months. Edward came back in the spring of 1471, Clarence defected back to him, and the York king thrashed his opponents. Henry VI's son was killed, followed soon after by the Lancastrian king himself, who was almost certainly murdered in the Tower on Edward's orders, and as for Warwick, he died in battle. The second reign of Edward IV lasted until his untimely death at the age of almost 41 in April 1483, of natural causes, I hasten to add, and was marked by his decision to have his brother Clarence executed by drowning in wine in the Tower of London in 1478. The king was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Other than dying young, he hadn't done too badly, perhaps because he only held the title Duke of York for a little over 2 months. Plenty of those who are yet to come on our list held it far longer and faced much more unpleasant fates. The next duke was Edward IV's younger son by Elizabeth Woodville, Richard of Shrewsbury, born in 1473 and created the Duke of York the following year. It was the first time the title was given to the monarch's second son, but as we'll see, it set a precedent which has continued to this day. In 1477, he was married off to Anne Mowbray when he was 4 and she was 6. His little duchess died in 1481, however. Richard was in London with his mother and sisters when his father died in April 1483, and when his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, seized control of the new king, 12-year-old Edward V. Elizabeth once again took her remaining children into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. She was famously compelled to hand York over to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Duke of Buckingham, though, in the middle of June on Gloucester's orders. He was placed in the Tower of London, where his older brother was already housed, supposedly in anticipation of the new king's coronation. However, it was immediately postponed, then the marriage of their parents was declared void, they and their sisters were declared illegitimate, and the 2 boys were never seen again after that summer. It was assumed by many, then and now, that they were killed on the orders of their uncle Gloucester, who had become Richard III. In 1674, workmen at the tower found the skeletons of 2 young boys under a staircase in the central White Tower, which were believed to be the boys. They were interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey on the orders of Charles II, but their identities have never been confirmed. Now, Richard III didn't hold the throne for long. He was deposed and replaced by his distant cousin Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII after the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. Henry married Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, and together they had 7 children. The third of these was born in 1491, named after his father, and created the Duke of York in November 1494. History knows him better as Henry VIII. Once again, the second son of the monarch had been made the Duke of York, but in little Henry's case, it wasn't just a matter of following the precedent set by his maternal uncle, the presumed dead Richard of Shrewsbury. It was about combating an impostor pretending to be that very uncle. This impostor was in actual fact called Perkin Warbeck, and he had begun to call himself Richard Duke of York, younger of the princes in the Tower and rightful King of England, in 1491. Probably born in about 1474 in Tournai, France, he likely worked in the cloth trade in his youth and at European courts. He found himself in Ireland in 1491, and that is where he began his impersonation of the almost certainly dead Richard of Shrewsbury, encouraged by the former Mayor of Cork, John Atwater, and English exile John Taylor. He gained a lot of prominent support, including from the Earl of Desmond, Charles VIII of France, Edward IV's sister Margaret of Burgundy, Maximilian King of the Romans, and King James IV of Scotland. Even members of the English court who were unhappy with the Tudor regime were drawn into the plotting. Ultimately, it was all for nothing, though. Though he did invade England in September 1497, his attempts to take the crown failed, and he was captured by Tudor forces in Beaulieu Abbey and brought before Henry VII on the 5th of October, where he confessed to being an impostor. Though fairly well treated at first and taken around England to be shown off as the pretender he was, after he escaped Henry's custody and was recaptured in June 1498, he was placed in the stocks twice, then locked up in irons in the Tower of London, where the Duke of Clarence's long-imprisoned son, Edward, Earl of Warwick, was also being kept. The following summer, the two were found to be conspiring against Henry VII, and so the king had them executed in 1499. Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn on the 23rd of November. Back to the other Duke of York alive at this time, though, the future Henry VIII. He continued to be known by that title until after the death of his older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, in April 1502. He was then made Prince of Wales himself in 1504 and no longer known as the Duke of York, though he did still have the title until he became king in 1509, as it is only if you become monarch that all your other earlier titles are subsumed by the crown. I trust I don't need to give you a rundown of the reign of this infamous king. In short, he married 6 times, had 2 of his wives judicially murdered, fathered Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, and split from the Catholic Church in Rome, despite actually being a Catholic himself, thereby setting England up to become a primarily Protestant nation. He died in January 1547. From 1509, the Duke of York title became dormant for the remainder of the Tudor era, and it was only when James VI of Scotland inherited the English crown from Elizabeth I in 1603 that the opportunity to revive it came up. James I of England, as he is often known, had 2 surviving sons with his wife Anne of Denmark. The eldest became Henry, Prince of Wales. The second, named Prince Charles, had been born in 1600 in Dunfermline Palace and was initially the Duke of Albany, the title traditionally given to the Scottish monarch's second son. He moved to England in 1604 to be with his parents and was made the Duke of York the following year. Just like Henry VIII, though, his fate was to take an unexpected turn after the early death of his older brother, which occurred in 1612 when the Prince of Wales was just 18. The almost 12-year-old Charles was now the heir to the throne and was made Prince of Wales himself in 1616. He would continue to technically hold the Duke of York title, though, until he became king in 1625. Charles married Henrietta Maria of France soon after his accession and had 9 children with her, of whom 5 made it to adulthood, including the future Charles II and James II. His reign famously ended in disaster, though. Having alienated many MPs in his parliament, the country descended into civil war in the 1640s, which Charles ultimately lost. After being captured and escaping, then being recaptured, he refused to agree to a constitutional monarchy and was ultimately executed at Banqueting House in London on the 30th of January 1649. He was buried with Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour in St George's Chapel at Windsor. England entered into a republic run by Oliver Cromwell, which lasted until 1660, when the monarchy was restored and Charles II took the throne. The following Duke of York was Charles I's second son, James, later James II, and the title was not the only thing he shared with his unfortunate father, for he too would lose the throne, though luckily not his head. Born in London on the 14th of October 1633, he was immediately named the Duke of York, though this was only made official in 1644, and he would hold this title for most of his life. The civil wars kicked off when he was still just a child, and he was taken captive along with 2 younger siblings in 1646. Having escaped without his younger siblings, he went to Holland in 1648, where his married sister Mary was living as the Princess of Orange, then lived in exile in various places in mainland Europe, serving in his cousin Louis XIV of France's army, until his brother Charles's restoration to the throne in 1660. With his royal position restored, he was made Duke of Albany, just as his father had once been, and promptly married his mistress, Lady Anne Hyde, who was already pregnant with his child at the time of the wedding in the summer of 1660. That baby died young, but the couple would ultimately have 2 surviving children, the future Mary II and Queen Anne. The reign of his brother was often difficult for James. Having been exposed to Catholicism during his time in France and initially reluctant to have anything to do with it, he had converted to the religion by the late 1660s, and when it became widespread knowledge in the mid-1670s after he stopped attending Anglican services, there were calls for him to be barred from inheriting the throne, which he was first in line for as Charles had no legitimate children. This long-running saga was called the Exclusion Crisis and was prompted by the virulent anti-Catholicism in England at the time, not helped by the Popish Plot of 1678, which was a supposed plan to kill Charles and replace him with James. The king stood by his younger brother, but at one point James was dispatched to Brussels, then Scotland, to keep him out of the way. His private life was complicated too. Most of his children with Anne Hyde died, then she did too in 1671, having first converted to Catholicism as well, by the way, and their daughters were raised Protestant on the orders of Charles II. James remarried to the 15-year-old Italian Mary of Modena in 1673. By 1685, though, all of their children were dead too, and in February that year, King Charles died as well, and James became king, with surprising support despite his religion. With no sons and 2 Protestant daughters as his heirs, who were both married to Protestants too, his reign was expected to be a bridge between Protestant monarchs, and did not raise the concerns it had in previous years. His illegitimate nephew, Charles II's oldest son, the Duke of Monmouth, tried to usurp the crown, but he was defeated and executed. Had James and Mary of Modena continued with no further children or only daughters, everything likely would have been fine. But when the Queen produced a healthy son named after the king in June 1688 on the back of some pro-Catholic measures from James over the preceding 3 years, England erupted in panic at the prospect of a new Catholic dynasty. False rumours, encouraged by James's daughter, Princess Anne, were spread that the baby was a changeling who had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan, and therefore was not the real heir, and by November the king's nephew/son-in-law William of Orange, married to his daughter Mary, had invaded England under the guise of protecting its laws. James, plagued by nosebleeds, fear, and the defection of his daughter Anne and her husband George of Denmark, among others, put up no strong resistance. He sent his wife and son to France on the 10th of December and was captured by William's forces on the 13th. He escaped on the 23rd, likely with William's connivance, and went to France too. William and his wife Mary were declared joint king and queen, and the whole episode has gone down in history as the Glorious Revolution. After one serious attempt to reclaim the throne by battling William in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, James lived out the rest of his days in exile in France with his wife, son, and another daughter named Louise, who was born to the couple in 1692. He and his descendants by Mary are known to history as the Jacobites, after the Latin version of the name James, which is Jacobus. He died in 1701. The crown passed through William III and his wife Mary II, then to her sister Anne, then, upon her death, with no surviving children in 1714, to the Hanoverians, a distant branch of the family descended from James I and, crucially, Protestant, at least for the most part. George I was the first of these monarchs, and it was his brother, Ernest Augustus, born in 1674, who was made the next Duke of York and Albany. This was unusual because Ernest was not the son of any king or queen of England, Scotland, or Britain, nor was he the elder of George's two surviving brothers, though the other, Maximilian, was Catholic and could not be in the line of succession, which might explain why he was overlooked. Ernest grew up in Osnabrück and Hanover, and led the life of a military man, fighting in the 9 Years' War and in the War of Spanish Succession. He may have been gay, and his correspondence with another soldier, Johann Franz Dietrich von Wendt, which he began in 1703, is sometimes seen as a romantic relationship. At any rate, he never married. When his brother acceded to the English throne, Ernest stayed behind in Hanover to represent the family interests there. George I was also the Elector of Hanover, and to be guardian to the second in line to the British throne, 7-year-old Prince Frederick, grandson of George I and son of the future George II, who was also left behind to represent the family in Hanover. Ernest became the Bishop of Osnabrück in 1715, and in 1716 he was made the Duke of York and Albany and the Earl of Ulster, perhaps, according to the Oxford DMB, to emphasise dynastic unity and the identification of the family with Great Britain. As far as I'm aware, though, he never came to England or any other part of the British Isles. Instead, he lived alternatively in Osnabrück and Hanover, and it was in Osnabrück that he died on the 3rd of August 1728. Next on the list, we have the second pretender to the title of Duke of York. This was Henry Benedict Stuart, the younger of the two grandsons of James II, via he and Mary of Modena son, Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. That's the baby born in 1688, whose birth sparked the Glorious Revolution. Born in Rome on the 6th of March 1725, Henry's mother was the Polish princess Klementyna Sobieska, and his older brother is known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie or the Young Pretender, to distinguish him from their father, known as the Old Pretender, and by Jacobites as James III. He was created the Duke of York as an infant, in opposition to Duke Ernest, who was still alive until Henry was 2.5, and had a troubled childhood as his parents' marriage disintegrated and his mother then died in 1735. Henry was not as caught up in trying to fight for the British throne in the way that first his father and then his older brother were, though when he learned that Charles had gone to Scotland to try to retrieve the crown, he was desperate to go with him, but never made it further than France before the Jacobites' resounding defeat at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746 was disclosed to him. His relationship with Charles, who began drinking heavily, then fell apart, and Henry, who was always very pious, became more interested in joining the Catholic Church, which he did in 1747, much to Charles's chagrin. He was known as Cardinal York and still used his Royal Highness title, so he certainly hadn't rejected his family's claim to the throne. His father died in 1766 and his brother in 1788, after which Henry styled himself King Henry IX, but he never made any attempt on the throne. He died in 1807 and was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. His death effectively marked the end of the Jacobite cause. During Henry Benedict's life, there were several other acknowledged Dukes of York, even after the death of Ernest Augustus in 1728. In 1739, Prince Edward Augustus of Wales was born to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his wife, Princess Augusta. He was their second son. Their elder became George III. The prince had a naval career, starting in 1758 when he was 19, and was well known for his promiscuity. He was created Duke of York and Albany and Earl of Ulster on the 1st of April 1760, and after his grandfather's death that October, his father had already died back in 1751, he became the heir to the throne of his brother, the new George III, until George became a father in 1762. He was made a member of the Privy Council and lived in St James's Palace, continuing to be employed in the Navy, but not allowed to actively serve until it was clear that the new Queen Charlotte would be producing a child in the near future. After a brief stint at command in 1762, he didn't have his own ship again, though he was made an admiral in 1766. The rest of his life is frankly rather unremarkable. He travelled around Europe enjoying himself and doing some light diplomacy work, and was a great patron of the theatre back in England, even acting in private productions himself on occasion. Despite numerous mistresses, he never married, and he fell ill with a fever on a trip to France and Monaco in 1767, and died in the Principality on the 17th of September that year. His body was returned to England and buried in the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey. We now move from George III's brother to his son. This was Prince Frederick Augustus, born in 1763 to George and Queen Charlotte. Made Bishop of Osnabrück by his father at the tender age of 6 months, it was a formality, and he was never intended for the church. Instead, he joined the army in 1780 at the age of 17, and on the 27th of November 1784, he was made the Duke of York and Albany and the Earl of Ulster. He travelled around Europe between 1781 and 1787 before returning to England, where he gained a reputation as a gambler and even fought a duel with the future 4th Duke of Richmond in 1789, in which he simply fired into the air after letting his opponent fire first. He married Princess Frederica of Prussia in 1791, but the marriage was a failure. The couple quickly separated, and there were no children. Prince Frederick fought in Flanders in 1793, 1794 and 1795, but did not impress with his military capabilities, which were limited. Nevertheless, nepotism is a powerful force, and he was still made the commander-in-chief of the army by his father in 1798. He didn't do particularly well in the job. His command of an army sent to invade Holland in 1799 turned into a failure, and though he tried to reform the army somewhat to eradicate some abuses and improve the lot of its soldiers, there was a scandal when it emerged that his mistress, Mary Clark, was using her connection to him to sell military offices. He had to resign his command post in 1809, though his older brother, by then the Prince Regent, gave it back to him in 1811. Thereafter, he continued to try to improve the condition of the army. He was made the guardian of his mentally ill father in 1818 after the death of Queen Charlotte, and when his brother became George IV in 1820, York became heir presumptive to the throne, as George IV's only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, was already dead. The Duke of York could have remarried after his wife's death in 1820 and tried to produce a child who would inherit the throne, but he never did so, instead allowing his younger brothers to engage in the infamous royal baby race which ensued after Princess Charlotte's death, and which had resulted in the birth of the future Queen Victoria in 1819. That said, he was apparently excited at the prospect of becoming king himself someday, stating that he'd have the same kind of coronation as his brother. But it was not to be. He died of dropsy on the 5th of January 1827 and was buried in St George's Chapel, Windsor. Now, you would think that the next Duke of York would be one of the sons of Queen Victoria, but actually she never conferred that title on any of them, though she did make her 4th son the Duke of Albany. The next Duke of York was instead one of her grandsons, and also the future George V. George was born in 1865 and was the second son of the future Edward VII and his wife Alexandra of Denmark. He joined the Navy at the age of 14, as it was his older brother, Albert Victor, who was meant to become king. However, when that prince died in January 1892, George's active naval career effectively came to an end, as he inherited the job of second in line to the throne, and also Albert Victor's fiancée, Mary of Teck, who he married in 1893. He was already the Duke of York by then, having been created so in May 1892, But when his father became king on the 22nd of January 1901, he was initially the Duke of Cornwall and York, because the monarch's eldest son is automatically the Duke of Cornwall, and was created Prince of Wales in November of that year, and thereafter ceased using the York title. He and Mary had 6 children, including the future Edward VIII, George VI, and the epileptic Prince John, who died in 1919, aged 13. George was also a very tough father whose children were scared of him. He inherited the throne himself in 1910, also becoming Emperor of India, and steered the United Kingdom through World War I, stripping relatives who fought for Germany of their British titles and even changing the family surname from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the solidly English Windsor in 1917. When his cousin Tsar Nicholas of Russia was deposed that same year, George had initially planned to offer asylum to the family, but changed his mind due to concerns about how the move would be perceived at home. Nicholas, his wife, and their 5 children were later murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918, to George's deep regret. George's reign also saw major events like the partition of Ireland in 1922, and in 1932 he began the tradition of the monarch's Christmas speech, something which continues to this day. The manner of his death in January 1936 is highly controversial, for as he lay unconscious and was nearing the end, his doctor, Lord Dawson of Penn, deliberately administered a fatal overdose to kill him more quickly, partly to spare the royal family from having to wait any longer, and partly to make the morning papers. Neither George, his wife, or their eldest son, who were both present, were informed or gave permission. It was regicide, and I'll leave my video looking at it in detail linked for you. The king was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. And so we come to the penultimate Duke of York on our list, George V's second son and the future George VI. Born Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George on the 14th of December 1895, the anniversary of the death of his great-grandfather after whom he was named, he was known as Bertie in the family and joined the Navy in his youth, then later moved to the newly established Royal Air Force. He was created the Duke of York in 1920 and married Scottish noblewoman Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, with whom he had 2 daughters, the future Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret. Bertie grew up expecting his older brother to be king, with seemingly no ambition for the throne himself. He famously had a stutter which made the speeches that royals are often required to give absolute torture, and which inspired the movie The King's Speech. After his father's death in 1936, his older brother did briefly become King Edward VIII for 10 months, before abdicating in order to marry Wallis Simpson and passing the throne to the horrified Bertie, who wept on his mother's lap when he realised the enormity of his new life. I have to say though, despite his trepidation, he did a fine job. He took his father's name as his regnal name, becoming George VI rather than the more Germanic-sounding King Albert, and saw the country through World War II, refusing to leave London even during the Blitz and despite the fact that Buckingham Palace was bombed with him and the Queen inside it. He took Britain from an empire to a commonwealth, earned great love and respect from his people, and when he died of lung cancer in February 1952, he was a long-term smoker, he was sincerely mourned. He was also buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. We finish with the most recent holder of the title, the former Prince Andrew, now known as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Born to Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh in 1960, he was their 3rd child and 2nd son. Like numerous royal princes before him, he joined the Navy and earned much praise for his service during the Falklands War in the early 1980s. It was upon the occasion of his marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 that he was created the Duke of York, which was by then the standard title for the monarch's second son, and the couple had 2 daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, before separating in 1992 and ultimately divorcing, though the divorce was very amicable and they have continued to live together for many of the years which have since passed. Andrew developed a very poor reputation with regards to his treatment of staff and many others he came into contact with, coming off as pompous, arrogant, and frankly not all that intelligent if reports are to be believed. He has also long had a reputation for being extremely promiscuous, overspending, and using his royal connections for personal gain. The thing which brought about his downfall, though, was his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and I assume you all know what that dirty little degenerate was guilty of. I can't get into details here in order to keep YouTube happy, but Andrew allegedly seriously mistreated, again, I'm very sorry I can't be more forthright than that, one of Epstein's victims, the teenaged Virginia Roberts, something he has always denied, and remained friends with Epstein even after the latter was convicted of very serious crimes against minors in the United States. A disastrous Newsnight interview in 2019 in which he discussed but did not express any serious regret for the friendship, and in which he made absurd claims that were shown to be lies, like not being able to sweat after an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War, and others which seemed very suspect, like suggesting that a photo of him with Virginia was fake and that he couldn't have danced with her at a nightclub in London or mistreated her afterwards because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking, led to him being effectively fired from royal duties. A pretty damning biography of him and his ex-wife was released in 2025, see my review of it linked on screen and below, and later that year emails between him and the by now deceased Epstein were released. These showed that he had further lied about when he terminated that friendship, ultimately leading to him being stripped of all his royal titles and honours that October and November, and finally forced to give up his home in Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate, which he had been under pressure to leave for some time. He will henceforth live on the King's private estate at Sandringham. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this list. I asked at the start if the title of Duke of York is very unlucky, even seemingly cursed. Let's sum up the fates of its 14 holders and 2 pretenders so far to see what we think. 6 were either murdered, executed, or died in battle. 6 didn't make it to their 50s. 2 were deposed. 1 has been stripped of his title, possibly 2. It's not clear if Richard of Shrewsbury would have been entitled to hold the dukedom after he was declared illegitimate. And the one who lived the longest is the one who was a born and raised Jacobite, lived his whole life in exile from his supposed country, and wasn't even recognised as the Duke of York anyway by most people. These aren't inspiring statistics. Do I think the title is cursed? No, I don't believe in such things. Do I think it's tainted by all the horrible things which have happened to or been done by its holders? Yes, I'm afraid I do. What next for the title, though, and could things improve? Well, in the normal course of things, Prince Louis would become the next holder of it sometime after his father becomes king. But honestly, if I was him, I might be like, seriously, Dad, it's okay. Just keep it. If you want to make me a duke, maybe give me the Cambridge title, which will be available again once William becomes monarch. There is, of course, a precedent for this, as Queen Victoria did not bestow it on her second son, or any of them in fact, and it might be wise to follow her lead and just let this title remain dormant until the 22nd century, long after Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor is dead. Let me know in the comments which Duke of York is your favourite or least favourite and why, and to learn more about some of the men and events I've discussed in this video, or to hear about other royal titles, try one of these options next. Alternatively, open up the description box under this video, which has a whole host of related topics for you to choose from. Till next time all, keep learning.